Hello, everyone. Phantoms and phantom hunters, people of all kinds. Welcome to the channel. I'll give everyone a couple minutes to get settled, and then we're going to basically do a live stream of me recording one of the how to writes. So the how to writes are a little different from the actual scripts I do, as you've probably noticed before in the past. My scripts are fully written out, a lot like an audiobook. So then I actually have to read it out as it's written directly and then kind of go from there. The way I do these writing scripts is I go over some points I want to go over, and then I just kind of let myself go. I write down the points I want to talk about and then continue. Please note, you might have noticed my little talking points have gotten a little long. I swear I try to shorten them, but sometimes things happen. So let's get the audacity ready. This is the app I use for all my recording stuff. I like it because it's free and it's very dependable, and I don't get inundated with ads every 3 seconds. Looks knowingly at other programs. You either know or you don't know. If you don't know, be glad you don't. Make sense? I make sense. Yeah, I just want to shorten this a little bit, but I think I'll have to do it this way. So, custom kits, who may or may not be watching, not sure, had a request for me. He wanted to figure out how to do believable characters, which I actually have entire script for. I also have a full of the horror characters. I actually did a newsletter with Leanne James I sent out to some people, and you can access that newsletter in the coffee link down below. Now, we're going to start on the believable characters. If we're lucky, I will answer any questions you'll have. Just feel free to post them in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to assist. So, does anyone have any questions before we start? Hello, Kingan. Good to see you. Do you have any questions before we start? Dishonesty is not in my design. Okay, so just to go over the points, I'm gonna talk about how to make believable characters here. If we're lucky, you can ask any questions here, and I'll either try to include them in the final video or I'll try to answer them here. Cool? Cool. Beginning recording. So, with making believable characters, one of the first things you have to start with is the theme of the story. When you understand the theming of the story, you can have a better idea of what is or isn't a believable character. So, an adventure story is going to have very different characters from a horror story, which has different characters from a comedy story. When you understand the theme of the story that you want to go on, you have a better idea of what kind of characters you have. So, for example, you could definitely do some scary stuff in a horror story that may not necessarily fly in a comedy. That being said, you definitely can have characters that are in stories that don't necessarily match them thematically. However, when that's done, it's usually done with a reason and should be done with your understanding. For example, with Jaskier in the Witcher show, who's again called Dandelion in in the games and the books, but let's move past that. He's a very comedic character. He's played comedically, and he says comedic things, and he does comedic things. Quite honestly, it is quite a juxtaposition compared to a lot of the dark horror and dark fantasy of the Witcher series. That being said, it's done with a reason, and it can offer sobering insights at times. Because A, he's a comic relief, which can help be used to help relieve some of the tension of any given horror story. And it also offers sobering insights in times, such as I believe it was season two, when it was revealed that he was actually smuggling elves and other people being discriminated against, attacked in these big pogroms, that he showed that the reason he cared about them is because he's an artist. Artists have to care about the vulnerable people around them because the vulnerable people are the artists themselves. And if someone doesn't speak up for the vulnerable people, they come for the artist in the end. Again, it's a very sobering insight of the character and an interesting one. And it also makes sense why characters like Gontier O'Dim and even the the Wild Hunt are so interested in him because he offers insights into this world, and he's the way he shares his stories can make or break entire revolutions. And again, he's just a funny character. At least he starts as just the funny character of this dark fantasy. Now, if you do, let's say, a comedy, we'll say, for example, Cabin in the Woods. That's a horror comedy. You might have characters there that don't quite juxtapose who seem like they might be an odd choice. You have a comedic scientist who does an awkward dance. That fits better in a comedy than it does in a horror. Again, you offer comic relief. You also offer insight into this, where these people are doing these horrible things, and these people are just living their lives, even after they do these horrible things. So it makes you think of your coworkers who might act in a similar way, who do the same dorky things or say the same dorky stuff. Like when he's talking with the Harbinger, and then the Harbinger is like, "Don't put me on speakerphone without telling me, man." And then the Harbinger goes into his dark spiel, which again fits thematically for horror. But then when you do the "Am I still on speakerphone?" then it makes things seem more comedic. It offers a tension break, and again, and gives you insight into these characters. So, when if you're going to do a protagonist that is going to be using this kind of thing, then you're gonna do then you should be careful with it. Because if you understand your characters, you can understand what is or isn't a good juxtaposition. Okay, I'm gonna pause there so that way I can explain a little bit more. That way I can mark the times these things are gonna go at. Because I'm when I do the final edit of this video, we're gonna need special times up. So what time is it at? Let's say 3:46. Looks like we got a couple people watching. That's good. Once upon a life. Mhm. Awesome. Saving that because I'm using Libra and I gotta save constantly. So let's talk about relationships to protagonists. This will be fun. Another way of focusing on making a character relatable or at least believable is the relationships to the protagonist. Ultimately, to make a believable character, you need to understand your protagonist and the character's relationships to the protagonist. The child is going to have a different relationship to their parent than to their teacher. Even an adult is going to have a different relationship with their parent than a child or a teenager to a parent, or even any kind of variation you can think of there. Understand who your protagonist is, and from there, you can craft the relationships to the characters around them. Crafting protagonists is going to be a completely different video, but here are a few basics that we can talk about. Once upon a life, when I was brought to life. So be sure you stay hydrated, Kingen. This is going to be important. So the protagonist is the character who the story is about. In most stories, the protagonist is also the one telling the story. In some circumstances, usually anthologies, the narrator is completely separate from the protagonist. So if you're doing a story like this, then you have to consider your narrator as a separate character to the protagonist. And you also have to consider what's their relationship to the protagonist. Do they have a relationship to the protagonist, or are they just kind of someone who's talking about this? Again, the way I do my videos is, for the most part people like the Seven Cities Journalist is separate from most of the characters that they're telling stories about. So because of that, they're a separate character, but they are a character in that world. So when I write those stories, I have to go into it with that consideration. There's always that infinitesimal but that near invisible line between the narrator and the protagonist. And there are times where when you're considering this, you have to make choices like that. Let's use an example outside of YouTube. Let's say those anthology shows like Tales from the Crypt Keeper or Elvira's show, or even, I don't know, Mystery Science Theater 3000. The narrator is someone separate from it. There's someone who does a setup to the show. They might tell a joke or two. They might tell you what the story is about. Then they present the story, and when the story is done, or sometimes during the story, in case of Mystery Science Theater 3000, they actually talk about the story. They might tell a joke, they might offer comedic relief, and generally speaking, there's a bit of mystery to who they are. And again, that's if you're doing that style of thing. If your narrator is separate from your protagonist, you have to consider them as a separate character. But in most stories, your protagonist is the narrator, and in most stories, your protagonist is the hero. Again, that's not always the case because ultimately your protagonist is just the one your story's about. Your story could be told from a monster's perspective. Your story could have a protagonist who's a serial killer. Your story could have death as the protagonist, for all I know. So just consider if I'm going to be making a protagonist, this is just their perspective. They don't necessarily have to be a good guy. So when crafting the protagonist, you have to understand your character's age, gender, ethnicity, wealth, species, if applicable, and their role and place in society, what they want from the story, and what they are being opposed by. Relatively little details can make a big impact on the character's perspective. Someone who is working poor is likely a day or to a day or two off work, or they're gonna see that a little differently from someone who can go on a 6-month hiatus from work and not even notice their money's being stolen. Looks knowingly at another creepypasta. Seriously, the guy I took a 6-month hiatus from work was being chased by an assassin. Had the assassin stealing $1,000 from his bank account every week, and he didn't even notice that was happening. Buddy, I get you were bored with your life, but maybe you should have just gone on a vacation. Seriously, seriously. Nonetheless, you have to consider these things because, like, these little details can make a big impact on their perspective, and again, can also make a big impact on how believable or unbelievable your character is. So, if your character is someone who is working in an office and is bored with life, and then they can take a 6-month hiatus, that's going to feel a lot less realistic than someone who is working poor and who is forced to take a week off to recover from an injury and is worried about paying the rent. And again, the gender differences is a fun one to think of. Someone who is masculine, feminine, or non binary, whether they're cis, transgender, or any sort of variation of that, they're going to have very different perspectives on things as simple as walking home alone at night, or even shopping for clothes, getting a haircut, choosing what food to eat, finding an animal to shop for, shopping for their friends, shopping for themselves. All those perspectives are going to be changed, sometimes immensely so, by just considering gender and whether they're trans or cis. So again, if you believe that it isn't important to have a character gender for the story, you're going to have to digest and think about the reason why it isn't important. Because again, you could legitimately tell a story like that. And again, there are things that are universal, but you do have to consider and really think about it. And so you're also going to have nationality and race will have an impact on the story and both the perspective of the character and how everyone around them sees them. Please note that nationality, race, and ethnicity are not necessarily interchangeable. People can have the same nationality and be a different race. People can have completely different nationalities have the same race. And then ethnicity, which is a blending of culture, nationality, race, can all have big impacts. Again, it comes down to perspective and location. Someone who's black in America is going to have a different perspective from someone who is black in France, or someone who is black in Nigeria, or someone who is black in Korea, or someone who is black in Australia, or black in Brazil. All of those are going to have very different character perspectives and something you should consider if those are the kinds of stories you want to tell. And again, nationality is a fun one to think of because, again, depending on your audience and depending on the stories you tell, you may notice that a certain nationality comes up a lot. If you listen or read a lot of American stories, you're going to have a lot of protagonists that are American. If you read a lot of stories from Europe, you're going to have a lot of European protagonists. If you listen or read stories from Asia, you're going to have a lot of stories from there. Again, something you can consider. And again, knowing what your protagonist wants can drive the conflict, especially when there is a force, monster, or villain opposing their goals. Again, the conflict doesn't necessarily have to be something literal or even physical. Your story can be something as simple as getting up from the couch to get something from the fridge, and their conflict is their own laziness. Or it could be something as complex as they want to unite their family, and their conflict is the family is scattered across the world or time and space. Again, understanding what the opposing force is to what they want can make things interesting. Because again, let's use that family uniting example. Your family is lost at a park. You want everyone to come together. That's a relatively simple conflict. Now you add an opposing force. They're scattered in the same park, but they're scattered across time. Well, now you've just made the conflict a little more sci-fi or a little more horrific, depending on how you look at it. And again, you can do a lot of interesting things with it. So when you want to make something believable, you have to understand what kind of protagonist you want to create, and then you can see what you can do with them. Again, there's a whole video I can do on protagonists, and I've done an entire newsletter just on characters. So we're gonna have to use this as a simple little jumping off point. I should probably talk about antagonists, actually. Thank you for bringing that up, Kingen. I'm just thanking you because you're the one person I can see right now. I see we have three people, so awesome. So let's talk about antagonist, opposing force. Again, antagonists are a whole other video, so I should be recording this now. Just let me get a drink. And I'm out of liquid death. Give me one moment. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I'm back. Got more liquid death, so let's open that and then get started. Bleh. Now, the opposing force to the protagonist is the antagonist. Antagonists are definitely interesting in horror settings because it goes from the simple man versus nature or man versus self or man versus other men and starts becoming something you can really explore in a fictional or creative way. So now it's not just man versus nature, it'll be man versus a monster, or it might be a man versus themselves as a clone. Oh yeah, definitely. The conflict with one's laziness can really hit home. And again, the fun with horror is that you can make it something supernatural, or you can just try to make it something relatable. And when you want to make it feel like a believable conflict, you got to describe the full feeling there, where it's just like, okay, you're talking about the gravity of the bed. What does that feel like? What do the sheets feel like? Do they have a smell or do they have a taste? Anything like that. Really think about it and break it down to its simplest and lowest level. And you can make people who don't feel the way you do understand the way you feel the way you do. One of the fun parts of writing and one of the fun parts of fiction. So let's see, opposing force, man versus monster, I believe was the last thing I was on. So, and again, you can have supernatural forces all over the place. And sometimes you can have a monster or conflict that's not necessarily something literal, but is something that can be metaphorical. So let's use a rather fun example. It's not technically a horror movie, but I like it because it's really allegorical. Pacific Rim. If you're familiar with Pacific Rim, you have these giant robots called Jaegers versus these giant kaiju called kaiju. And the kaiju, you realize later on in the movie, are a stand in for hurricanes because they use a similar classification system based on water displacement and how toxic their blood is, similar to how we classify hurricanes by how much force is generated in them. So this gets interesting because it's you start to realize these kaiju are not just the monster, they're also a disaster that keeps getting worse, keeps getting worse, keeps getting worse. And humanity keeps trying to oppose it and keeps trying to build machines to fight it, or in some points tries to build a seawall to contain it. And as you probably noticed, is that doesn't quite work, and they have to go a very direct means of dealing with it. So again, sometimes when you're creating a monster, you have to think not just what the monster is, what does it represent? So let's use Jason from the Friday the 13th franchise. What does he represent? Is he a stranger danger? Is he a territorial force? Is he a supernatural threat? Is he a threat of bullying? Is he basically an anti bullying or an anti sex PSA on steroids? Again, these are things you want to think about when you're making your characters. Sometimes it can be as simple as the monster is a monster. It is a creature and it acts that way. And again, that's a valid way of doing your story and writing it. So if you consider what your antagonist represents to the protagonist or why they're opposing him, you can make it feel realistic. So if you have your family trying to unite across time, well, what's the force opposing it? Is it time itself? If so, then you might make the conflict feel realistic. People wanting to connect with others, connecting with their loved ones, connecting with their family, only to be separated by time. You'll see things like that a lot, especially with family members who are passed away or family members who live far away, or even just people who change across time. We'll see you, Kingan. So you'll see things like that. And when you think about it, it can make a very unrealistic conflict feel very realistic. So with that in mind, because again, antagonists are a whole separate video, let's talk about the different kinds of relationships the protagonist can have with characters around them. So first, we're going to talk about the relationship of silent strangers. Your protagonist, whoever they are, have degrees of relationship with everyone around them. Imagine, if you will, a city with millions of people in it. As you travel through the city, you're not likely to think too much of the people around you. You might notice if they are in your way, you might notice if they do something incredibly unusual. But in situations with like a vast crowd of people, especially in situations like train stations, city streets, or factory floors, you need to establish what a sense of normality is and if a majority of people are behaving normally or not. So, people in a train station are going to behave similar but differently than those on the street. People in a prison are going to behave differently from a factory. So, establish what is expected in the setting full of strangers and whether or not the strangers are behaving normally. So let's use some examples. So if you're using a factory floor, a normal expectation is a lot of people are working. A lot of the people are on the machines. It's probably a loud place. There might be some people scurrying around, but overall people are sitting and working. That's your normal expectation, and then you can establish that. But then you can also establish people behaving unusually. Wait, it's a factory floor, but it's silent. It's a factory floor, but no one's talking. It's a factory floor, but it's empty. You establish what feels normal, then you can establish what feels abnormal to the situation. So once people get a sense of what is or isn't normal, then you can start to tease them or build their dread by showing them what's abnormal about the situation. And again, you can't go into this assuming that everyone in your audience knows what it's like to be in a city like yours, or knows what it's like to be in a factory, or knows what it is like to be in a prison. You have to establish that sense of normality and that sense of abnormality. Because again, not everyone's been in a prison. Not everyone's been in a city. Not everyone's even been in a factory. And again, you can't go into this assuming everyone knows what this is like. So again, let's talk about that a little more. So when you're a crowded auditorium is expected to stare at you when you're on stage. So also establish who your protagonist is in this setting. So let's use the example of the train station. If your protagonist is a passenger, there's an expectation of the way they act. Now, what if they're the janitor of the train station? The expectation of the way they act is going to be different. What if they are the conductor of the train station? Again, the way they act is expected to be different. What if they're a police officer on the train station? Their behavior is going to be different. What if they're the robber of the train station? Again, that's going to be very different. So again, you have to establish who your character is to this setting that they're in, and who they are to the strangers around them. Because again, strangers are expected to act a certain way and can react very differently. Silent strangers are going to react differently to an armed gunman than they are an armed police officer, at least depending on situation and country. But my point still holds. Now, when you're describing a setting like that, you don't have to describe every single stranger, but describing the actions of one or two can establish an expectation. At the train station, talk about a tired parent wrangling their children, the musician in the corner trying to earn tips while performing, or the anxious teenager constantly checking the phone and the train's arrival. Those examples, along with the train station being crowded, can establish one vibe. Or you can mention the train station is empty, except for those examples. Well, now that makes the character and the setting have a very different vibe. Now, suddenly you're in an empty train station, except for the musician in the corner, except for the tired parent, and except for the anxious teenager. And also bear in mind, people are just strange. They'll be doing stuff like charging phones on their heads, pulling a fish out of their backpack, or holding babies up to paintings to look at them. These moments of individual strangeness allows your reader to glimpse the depths of humanity and how interesting people truly are, especially with settings where you're not going to get to know these characters very well. And those little bits of strangeness makes the character feel much more realistic or at least believable. Because then it's the, oh yeah, I've seen people do weird stuff at the train station. Yeah, I've seen people do weird stuff at the factory floor. Hey, I've seen weird people in the city. I don't know if you've known this, but there are people in cities. We will discuss setting later, but remember, your setting is a character. So anything that we talk about with characters can also be talked about with your setting. Yeah, setting being a character. Once I made that point, like it's never, ever, ever left my mind. And it's never going to leave my mind, is it? Hello, people. Do we have any questions so far? Taking another sip of liquid death. So, after the silent strangers, we have familiar faces. Do you ever see people a lot, and even though you don't know their name, they're still a part of your day? Maybe a stranger who takes the same bus as you, who nods at you every time you see them, or a barista at a coffee shop who remembers your favorite order, but you only remember their name and face when looking at them. Or maybe a security guard who stands in front of City Hall, who always opens the door for you when they see you. Some people may still be strangers to you, but you still see them often enough to at least be familiar with them. When describing them, the protagonist should have a degree of familiarity with them. Describe the outfit the docent wears at the door. Docents are doorkeepers or ticket takers. Their smile, their voice, or the action they take when opening the door. Do they smile at the protagonist? Does it feel automatic or genuine? Do they make eye contact or do they look away from the protagonist? Do they talk to the protagonist directly or do they talk to the ground? Do they stand up straight and take their job seriously or do they slump and act bored? Better yet, do they do these things in unexpected combinations? Do they smile at you but look at the ground? Do they slump until they notice you and stand up straight? Is their smile automatic until you smile back? These little details make the familiar faces feel familiar to the audience as well. These characters, you are okay to mention who they are and what they mean to the protagonist, but the way they look and the way they act reveals who they are as people to the audience. To use an example from, we have a character who actually grabs a coffee pot, tries to cut line to get food in front of everyone else. But then when he grabs the coffee, he refills someone else's coffee cup first before he refills his. What does that tell you about the character? Someone who's willing to cut in front of a bunch of strangers, but when he's talking to someone, he's willing to fill their coffee first before his own. That tells you more about his character and who you can and what kind of person you can expect from him than just directly stating it. Again, at this point, the only thing you know about him is his name and face. So again, familiar faces. These faces have to feel familiar to your protagonist, and then they can feel familiar to the audience. And again, it's a lot easier to show than tell. Sometimes there are things you have to tell, but it helps to show things, for example. It allows you to hint at depths without requiring the audience to know their entire backstory. If you mention the bus driver has a picture of their family and a Pokemon keychain, that adds depth to them and allows you to recognize them as people. Plus, familiarity can also allow you to show contrast as well. If your barista has never smiled at you their entire life and has always served you the best coffee you've ever tasted, and one day they're beaming at you and they burn the coffee, then you know something is different about them, if they're even the same person. While your protagonist doesn't have to be friends with the familiar faces, they should at least be aware of who they are and have a passing familiarity. They should be able to convey that to the audience. Little details and emotions and show that familiarity. But again, I'll leave it to you as the writers to figure out what is the best way to convey familiarity in your own story. Seriously, always make sure to hydrate when doing these long videos. They come in handy. So now we have professional pals, people you know professionally, but not necessarily personally. From celebrities to coworkers, politicians to public servants, your protagonist will understand their role to them and their role to the professional. So, for example, if you're going to see a police officer, your protagonist is going to have some sort of relationship with at least the idea of a police officer, if not necessarily that police officer themselves. Do they have a do they you like the police? Do they hate the police? Do they consider the police a nuisance or a threat? Do they consider the police a helper or do they consider them even friends? Again, their relationships to these professionals around them, whether it's a coworker or just a role that they're familiar with, will tell you a lot about them and the way your protagonists deal with them. Your protagonist will understand your role to them and to their professional. However, it also nearly guarantees you won't know who they are fundamentally. If your protagonist has had a coworker for 10 years, they will probably know their coworker's name and birthday, maybe a few details about their life, but they won't know them on a personal or friendly level unless they actually are friends or if they actually know them close. So, unless you are friends with your coworker or local public servant, then overall, these are going to be just the professional pals. For characters of this role, you can describe them physically, but the best way to show them as someone believable is to describe your feeling the protagonist has towards the professional or what they represent. They don't have to be the same thing. You can like the county clerk you've had to get permits from for years and still hate having to go get the permits. Do they hate their coworkers but are forced to act professional for their own job? Or maybe a celebrity speaking on TV and your protagonist is enraptured by what they have to say because they're a fan. Maybe they trust the person speaking on TV. Or do they see the person speaking on TV and they scoff before turning away because they think everything they say on TV is fake? While this can overlap with other character types to make these characters believable, you should focus on how they make the protagonist feel. And if you want to you can show juxtaposition by having another opinion compared to the protagonist. Are they creeped out by the clown that works at the nearby car dealership, but their best friend finds them hilarious? Do they find a singer attractive while their sibling only says how gross they are? Sometimes these characters represent institutions or concepts, and in cases like that, focus on the character's feelings towards the institutions. Does your protagonist see the police and think they represent safety from a threat? Or do they see the police as a threat to their goals? Or do they look at the police or in scoff? Any of these reactions can add depth to your protagonist or characters close to the protagonist. Do they look at soldiers and see them as just someone doing a job? Or do they look at soldiers and do they see heroes? Do they look at soldiers and do they have a panic attack? Again, these are all different ways ways of making your characters feel believable. Everyone has some different thought process about the professionals in their life or the professionals around them. And again, you can make characters feel believable in some way. If they hate the government, that's going to feel believable. They love the government, that's also going to feel believable. If there's some weird conspiracy theorist that believes the government's right about everything, that's also going to be a character. People are going to find it weird as heck, but at least it's going to feel like a believable character because it's something that they can engage with. And if you want another example, do they see priests as someone who helps or someone who are dishonest? These types of characters focus on how they make the character feel more than how they look to make them feel believable. But you don't have to ignore how they look either. Getting a basic idea of how they look can certainly help. Does the police officer look disheveled or do they look professional? Are they wearing body armor at all times or are they just as wearing civilian clothes? Do they walk a certain way? Do they pose a certain way? For someone who's been in the United States, you probably get a pretty good vibe of how police look and walk, even when they're not in uniform. Again, things like this can make a character feel more believable because again, it's not just how they look, it's how do they make the protagonist feel and what do these people represent to the protagonist. And again, these are not necessarily friends, although they can be. And again, that leads us to our next bullet point, close companion. Then we have the close companion. These are your best friends, your friend group, people you know well or think you know well at least. These characters aren't those you describe how they make you feel. You are going to describe little details, their feelings, their goals, and how they are acting in the scene. They aren't just acting normal or strange. They aren't just making you feel good or sad. These are the people you have stories with, details that mean a lot. You cannot just say what the detail is, you need to describe why it is. Where you mentioned the bus driver has a Pokemon on the keychain, or a family in the photo for a close companion, you will know who in the picture is still alive, what relationship they have with the companion. You will say what the Pokemon it is and what the story behind it, if you know it. Is the Pokemon their favorite? Maybe it was a gift from you or someone else. Close companions are where you can allow your characters to grasp not just complexity, but also contradictions that reveal a lot about them. They may be someone who loves diner food, but who also only shops organic for their own groceries. They might be someone who donates to church every Sunday and every Monday they rob banks. They may be someone who loves puzzles and is absolutely terrible at them. Fun fact, I'm describing someone I know in all of those situations. Good luck figuring out who is who because I don't know. Your close companions will have stories with your protagonist. And you aren't going to just say a single line or two to imply closeness. You have to show it. Depending on your story, if it's an entire series of novellas, then you can get the closeness gradually unravel. If you're doing a short story, you should spend at least a paragraph or two. And if you want your audience to care for a character, the protagonist should care for them and have depth to their care. And again, this can really represent a lot of things. There's a difference between Antony from Ant Man and Daisy, John Wick's dog, from the John Wick series. Because again, it's not just what they are or what they represent, it's what do they mean to the characters? How does that make them feel? Because again, you're with a close companion, you're going to get a good sense of like, oh, I see my friend. I can see they're upset. I think they're upset because of this reason. Or even just like oh, their lips quivered in this moment. So this means this emotion, or this means they're thinking this thought. Again, when you get to close companions, that's where you start to know and understand what they're feeling, possibly what they're thinking. And again, you have to show these stories and depth with them. You can't just do oh, we used to shoot turkeys together at the farm. Oh, this is just like that time we stood up to the bullies up in the alley. Remember that? Or things like that. Again, you can do little jokes like that to add to it, but you can't have that be your entire thing. To use an example from the MCU, when and both Hawkeye and Black Widow mention Budapest together. It's like, "Oh, it's just like Budapest. You and I remember Budapest very differently." They don't reveal until much later what exactly happened in Budapest, and it just raises more questions than answers. And that is basically the entire backstory we get between them, which is again a little weird, but whatever. And again, you can use these little jokes and things to imply closeness, but again, you have to show these things in a way that matters. And again, there are a lot more than one ways to do it. So I'll leave it to you to decide which is best. But consider if you want your characters to care about a close companion, you can't just kill them off. You can't just be like, oh, whatever, this happened and now it's over. You need to have them have an actual sense of closeness and some kind of relationship to each other. Again, if you're going to kill someone off as like your verified victim, or if you need to or you need your doomed companion, then you need to show why they're important or why they care. If you're doing Coraline, you'd show an entire relationship from strangers to friends between YB and Coraline. And then you also see that closeness with YB's clone, and you understand why by showing YB's body is so upsetting for Coraline. So again, you get a chance to actually let that breathe and let that unravel and get a chance to show it. And again, things like that really matter. So know your format of the story and you can do it pretty well. And again, maybe your protagonist doesn't have any close companions to them, and that's okay too. But just be aware here, that's a good way of showing a believable type of close companionship with them. But when we get past close companion, we get to something a little more extreme. Ah, looks like we picked up another person. Okay, so how do I make so you have a question about following archetypes without falling to cliches or stereotypes. That is a good question. And here's the big hint for that. The trick is you have to add details and also understand that a character is more than their archetype. So let's use an example of like there's character archetypes in a lot of 80s style horror of like the jock, the cheerleader, the pretty one, the nerdy one, things like that. If you add details or you show reasoning, it makes things feel a little more interesting. Cool, you have a jock character. Well, why are they a jock? Well, they're struggling in class, and this is the only way they can manage to actually they use for managing stress. And this allows them a chance to succeed where others can't. It's implied a lot in 80s horror, but never flat out stated that a lot of times the jock is the jock because that's their only way to be out of the town that they're in. Or the nerdy character. Okay, so they're withdrawn, they're quiet, they read a lot of books. Why are they like that? Well, usually they get bullied a lot. Sometimes that's their only companionship. Sometimes that's the only way to do that. So again, those little details can make things feel like less of a cliche. And again, it comes down to what do these things represent to you and how do you do it? So we're going to talk about these points much later in in the video, Mackenzie. But a big part of this is this understanding. You, as the writer, have your own unique perspective. Show your perspective, and you're going to show that something that's not just cliche. You don't just do something because that's the way it's always done. You don't just do something because that's what the audience expects, and you shouldn't do something just because the audience is looking for something like that. As fun as something as like Pitch Meeting or Cinema Sins or all these other critics who get paid on YouTube to who point out stereotypes and point and laugh at those films and stuff, as fun as those may be to watch, that's not encouraging to your writing either. You, as the writer, should do something that you want to do. If you want to do a nerdy archetype and make him the jock too, do that. If you want to do a cheerleader but want to make them a disabled old man, do that. And again, to avoid stereotypes, again, it kind of comes into understanding why is the stereotype there, and then allows you to deconstruct it and avoid it. So let's say, for example, Let's use a cliche one. Why were a lot of Asian characters from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s given a nickname rather than an actual name? Well, a lot of times they were trying to avoid that cliche of like, well, you have an Asian or foreign sounding name. Haha, we can't pronounce it, so we just gave you a nickname instead. So that's where that stereotype comes from. So how do you avoid that? You give them a name that's not a nickname. Or you give everyone around them a nickname and make it so that they're not the only one who's excluded for doing something like that. So again, it allows you to, if you understand these characters and these archetypes and these stereotypes, you can break them down and you can do new things with this. Does that help at all, Mackenzie? Also, welcome back, Kingan. Sorry I didn't get to say that. I'm glad that can definitely help, Mackenzie. If you do have further questions about that, feel free to email me. I'm at lyoko1492 at gmail.com, sending it in the chat, and then I'll try to directly answer anything afterwards, okay? Or we can also directly reach out to Leanne James too, because we talked about archetypes and stereotypes a bit at SAC Anime and a bit in our newsletter. So, but if you need more specifics, we're more than happy to assist. Now let's talk about blood brothers. So with blood brothers, not literal blood brothers, but this is the depth of the character. The protagonist isn't just thinking about what they are feeling. They will see things and it will remind them of their blood brother. They may be shopping and see a Jeff the Shark comic and immediately think about how their friend has been looking for it. Your protagonist isn't just knowing what they are feeling it with their blood brother. The betrayal of a companion hurts. The betrayal of a blood brother will feel like you're dying. And again, this can be romantic, this can be platonic, this can be somewhere between platonic and romantic. It can be whatever Sam and Frodo had, it can be whatever Magneto and not Magneto had. It could be whatever you had between Odysseus and Penelope. Your blood brother characters may not even like your protagonist. Magneto and Professor X come to mind. Even as enemies, the level of respect and understanding between them is profound. They have a long history and a lot of care between them. And again, you see people try this a lot. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. Sometimes you get things like Megatron and Optimus Prime. Sometimes you're going to get stuff like Magneto and the X Men. Sometimes you're going to get all kinds of things. So again, when you get to this, you're not just thinking, what are they feeling? You are feeling what they are feeling. You know what they are thinking, at least in some way. Some can even interpret a blood brother bond as romantic, or even with a platonic interpretation. It is still a very deep level of understanding. Some characters will even be departed and still be blood brothers with each other. And if you want characters like that who have a deep, enduring impact on the protagonist, you will need a character that reminds your protagonist of them, even with unrelated sights or thoughts. You may hear a song that reminds you of your nemesis. You may see someone order extra ranch at a restaurant and be reminded of your abuser. Because again, these blood brother level bonds aren't always positive. These are just these levels of relationship where like these little things will remind you of this person. It's not just a casual, oh, this person is kind of interesting, or hey, maybe my best friend will like this. This is a you look outside, you see the sunlight, and you're reminded of their smile. You hear a noise in the walls, and you're reminded of the way they talk to you. Again, positive or negative. You may see a recommended video on YouTube and immediately have your shoulders slump because it was introduced to you by an ex once upon a time. But the contrast is also true. You may see a painting in an exhibit and think of someone you love, whether they are still around you or not. You may see a toy in a toy store and remember getting it for your child. You may see an artist painting and the color of yellow reminds you of your best friend. By focusing on how little things leads to big emotions, it can add believability to these kinds of characters. It can be done simply or complexly. In a fun example I'm going to try to link to later, In Monstrously Cute, there is a vampire named Carlotta who hears a banshee death metal band, and she's holding her hands close to her heart because it reminds her of a lullaby sung to her by her mother. Vampires and banshees are not realistic characters. However, someone hearing a song that reminds them of someone they love is either familiar to the audience on a personal level, or at least something understandable enough to make a very inhuman character suddenly very human, to make a very unbelievable character very believable. If you want a non horror example of this, let's look at the Avengers during the Avengers movie 2 with the Age of Ultron, when everyone comes around and they actually start trying to lift Thor's hammer. So everyone has different approaches to trying to lift Thor's hammer, but everyone's joking, everyone's talking about it, everyone's having a fun time. And again, the way they're interacting with the hammer and the way they're interacting with each other reveals a lot about their characters. Tony Stark makes a joke about it before he tries to lift it. When he suddenly realizes he can't lift it, he immediately gets a tool to help him. When the tool fails, he immediately calls his friend and then gives his friend a tool, and then both of them try to lift it together. That reveals a lot about his character and who he's closest with, which is in this case Ace, Ace War Machine. And then again, you're going to see people like Clint, who again makes a joke, tries to lift it, and again, people who don't quite get it. Who then use Natasha, who doesn't actually participate because again, she doesn't actually feel that quite get it. Who then use Natasha, who doesn't actually participate because again, she doesn't